He once agreed to let his daughter throw a party while he was supposedly enforcing a punishment, then spent the entire night trying to be both the strict father and the cool one at the same time, and somehow ended up failing at being either. Not because he couldn't decide which parent to be, because disappointing anyone, even briefly, even for good reason, felt to Phil Dunphy like a risk he'd rather avoid than actually take. Phil Dunphy never needed everyone to like him. He needed to never find out what happens if they didn't. Welcome back to The Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to see the panic behind every one of his smiles, and for years I laughed at Phil the same way everyone does. The goofy, overly enthusiastic dad who tries way too hard to be liked. But you don't just see a man with boundless optimism and questionable dance moves. You see someone who learned early that keeping everyone happy was the safest possible way to keep everyone around, and who has spent his entire adult life terrified of finding out what happens the moment he stops. By the end of this video, every eager, people-pleasing moment Phil Dunphy has ever had is going to look a lot less like enthusiasm and a lot more like quiet fear. There's a term for what Phil does. Psychologists call it people-pleasing, a pattern where someone consistently prioritizes others' approval over their own needs or honest opinions, often to avoid the discomfort of conflict or disappointment entirely. It isn't simple kindness. It's a specific strategy for managing anxiety. If everyone stays happy, nothing bad can happen, and you never have to find out what disapproval, rejection, or real confrontation might actually cost you. Phil doesn't try to please everyone because he lacks a spine. He does it because somewhere along the way, keeping the peace became the only version of safety he fully trusted. Phil's father, Frank, appears throughout the series as an eccentric, endlessly cheerful presence, prone to grand gestures and unconventional wisdom delivered with total sincerity. Frank rarely, if ever, models direct confrontation or difficult honesty, preferring enthusiasm and positivity as his default response to nearly everything, including situations that might call for something more pointed. That relentless cheerfulness, however endearing, teaches Phil something specific, that maintaining a happy, agreeable surface is not just preferable but achievable if you simply commit to enough enthusiasm and avoid whatever might disrupt it. Frank doesn't demonstrate how to handle real disagreement gracefully, because he rarely engages with it directly himself. He models avoidance disguised as boundless optimism, a lesson Phil absorbed completely. That inherited avoidance follows Phil directly into his own marriage, where real conflict, unlike with his father, becomes considerably harder to sidestep indefinitely. Phil's wife, Claire, is considerably more direct and confrontational than he is, comfortable raising disagreements, setting firm boundaries, and occasionally pushing Phil to be more assertive himself, particularly with their children. Their dynamic often plays out with Claire as the disciplinarian and Phil as the one undermining her authority by trying to stay the more likable parent. That imbalance isn't really about parenting philosophy. It's Phil's anxiety about disapproval extending into his marriage, where disagreeing with Claire or disappointing his children by enforcing her rules feels like a risk he'd rather quietly avoid than directly confront. Claire regularly calls out this pattern, sometimes with real frustration, recognizing that Phil's reluctance to be the bad guy occasionally leaves her carrying the weight of discipline alone. That specific tension, Phil avoiding conflict even when avoidance actively harms his marriage, becomes especially visible once you examine how he handles each of his children individually. Phil's relationship with his son Luke is defined by an almost desperate desire to be the fun, cool parent, often at the expense of appropriate boundaries or discipline. Phil regularly indulges Luke's more chaotic impulses, reluctant to be the parent who says no, even when saying no would clearly serve Luke better. That reluctance isn't really about parenting philosophy either. It's Phil's own fear of disappointing someone he loves, projected directly onto fatherhood. Being the strict parent risks Luke's momentary disapproval, and Phil, whose entire emotional architecture is built around avoiding exactly that discomfort, consistently chooses short-term approval over the harder, more valuable long-term guidance Luke sometimes actually needs. That pattern of prioritizing being liked over being effective repeats, in a different register, with his older daughter. Phil's relationship with his eldest daughter, Haley, follows a similar pattern during her teenage years, marked by his consistent reluctance to enforce real consequences for her more rebellious behavior. He wants desperately to remain her friend, her ally, rather than risk becoming the parent she resents, even when clearer boundaries might have served her better during a genuinely difficult period of her adolescence. That specific fear, being resented by his own child, drives much of Phil's parenting throughout Haley's teenage storylines. Claire regularly has to step in as the firmer voice, not because she cares more about Haley's well-being, but because Phil's anxiety about disapproval makes him functionally unable to hold a boundary once real pushback arrives. That same anxiety shows up in an entirely different form with his middle daughter, whose needs are considerably quieter and easier to overlook. Phil's relationship with his academically gifted middle daughter, Alex, reveals a subtler version of his people-pleasing pattern. Rather than actively managing conflict with Alex, he sometimes simply overlooks her needs because she rarely creates the kind of friction that demands his immediate attention. Alex doesn't act out. She doesn't create scenes. And Phil's conflict-avoidant instincts mean the child, causing the least disruption, sometimes receives the least deliberate engagement. That's a quieter, less obviously destructive pattern than his dynamics with Luke or Haley, but it reveals something important. Phil's people-pleasing isn't only about avoiding negative confrontation. It's about directing his limited emotional bandwidth toward whichever relationship currently demands the most active peacekeeping, often at the expense of the child who never makes him uncomfortable enough to prioritize. That same instinct to prioritize harmony over difficult honesty defines his relationship with the one family member whose approval he seems to want most. Phil's relationship with his father-in-law, Jay, is one of the show's most consistent sources of comedy, built almost entirely around Phil's desperate, ongoing quest for Jay's approval, a gruff, often dismissive approval that rarely comes as easily or as fully as Phil clearly wants it to. Phil regularly goes to absurd lengths trying to impress Jay, rarely pushing back directly even when Jay's comments genuinely sting. That dynamic isn't simple in-law awkwardness. It's Phil's core anxiety playing out with the one family member whose disapproval feels most threatening, precisely because it's rarely fully resolved. Jay represents a specific kind of traditional, plain-spoken masculinity that Phil, in his eagerness and emotional openness, never quite matches, and that gap keeps Phil perpetually auditioning, rather than simply accepting that Jay's love doesn't actually require his constant performance. That same eagerness for connection and approval extends into his friendships with his children's spouses, revealing a pattern that goes well beyond his immediate family. Phil's relationship with his brother-in-law Mitchell develops into one of the show's more genuine, if occasionally strained, family bonds, complicated by Phil's eager desire to be liked and included, sometimes in ways Mitchell finds slightly overwhelming given his own more reserved temperament. Phil rarely reads social cues suggesting he should pull back, continuing to push for closeness even when it isn't necessarily welcomed with equal enthusiasm. That imbalance, Phil consistently prioritizing being liked over reading the room accurately, shows up across nearly all his relationships, but it's particularly visible with Mitchell, whose more private, controlled personality contrasts sharply with Phil's constant emotional availability. Phil doesn't just want Mitchell's approval. He needs confirmation, repeatedly, that the relationship is as warm as he desperately wants it to be. That same pattern, needing constant reassurance rather than trusting a relationship's basic stability, becomes clearest of all in his dynamic with Cameron, whose personality most closely mirrors Phil's own eagerness. To understand Phil fully, it helps to understand the professional culture he's spent his career inside. As a real estate agent, Phil's livelihood depends directly on being likable, approachable, and endlessly accommodating, traits the profession actively rewards and reinforces daily. Real estate sales, particularly in a competitive suburban market, often selects for exactly the kind of relentless positivity and conflict avoidance Phil already brings to the job. That professional reinforcement doesn't create Phil's people pleasing from nothing, but it does give him a legitimate, well-compensated arena to practice and perfect it constantly. Being agreeable isn't just a personality trait for Phil. It's literally his job description, reinforced daily by clients who respond well to exactly the accommodating warmth his personal life has already trained him to offer automatically. That professional culture blurs the line for Phil between a useful sales technique and his actual approach to every relationship in his life, making it considerably harder to distinguish where the performance ends and his genuine personality begins. There's a second layer of context worth examining. American television comedy in the 2000s and 2010s increasingly popularized a specific fatherhood archetype: the enthusiastic, emotionally available, somewhat goofy dad, a deliberate contrast to the more distant, authoritative sitcom fathers of earlier decades. Phil represents this archetype almost perfectly, and the cultural celebration of that fun dad persona reinforces exactly the behavior his anxiety already drives him toward. Being the cool, approachable parent isn't just Phil's individual coping mechanism. It's a fatherhood ideal the broader culture was actively celebrating during exactly the years his character was written, giving his conflict avoidance a socially rewarded shape, rather than treating it as a genuine limitation worth addressing. That cultural backdrop explains why Phil's specific brand of people-pleasing often reads as charming rather than concerning, both to the show's audience and to Phil himself, even when it occasionally costs his children the firmer guidance they need. Phil's relationship with his stepmother-in-law, Gloria, is warm and largely uncomplicated, built on mutual affection and Phil's genuine enthusiasm for including her fully in family life. Unlike his more anxious pursuit of Jay's approval, his relationship with Gloria requires little performance, mostly because Gloria offers straightforward warmth without the conditional, gruff evaluation Jay tends to apply. That ease is revealing by contrast. When someone simply likes Phil without requiring him to earn it repeatedly, his usual anxious performance largely disappears. It suggests his people-pleasing isn't a fixed personality trait activated everywhere equally. It's specifically triggered by relationships where approval feels conditional or uncertain, exactly the dynamic missing from his easier, more secure relationship with Gloria. Phil's friendship with Cameron Tucker develops into one of the show's more surprising, genuinely warm dynamics, built on a shared enthusiasm for performance, sincerity, and emotional openness that neither man typically finds reciprocated as fully elsewhere. Cameron, like Phil, tends toward theatrical warmth and eagerness to please, and their friendship offers each of them a rare mirror. That mutual recognition matters. With Cameron, Phil doesn't have to perform enthusiasm to earn connection, because Cameron already operates in the same emotional register naturally. It's one of the only relationships in Phil's life built on genuine similarity rather than anxious effort, offering a version of friendship where his usual people-pleasing simply isn't necessary, because there's no gap between what he's performing and what Cameron already expects and enjoys. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Claire, the one everyone frames as the exasperated, more responsible spouse simply cleaning up after Phil's conflict avoidance, she's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, someone who needs Phil's relentless optimism just as much as he needs her willingness to be the firm one. Think about it. Claire grew up in a household with her own father's blunt, often harsh style of discipline, and much of her own adult anxiety centers on becoming too much like that model herself. Phil's constant softness isn't just an obstacle to her parenting. It's a genuine counterbalance she relies on. Someone whose instinct is always toward warmth first, keeping their household from tipping entirely into the harder-edged parenting style she was raised with, and still worries about repeating. So the spouse everyone assumes is simply managing Phil's avoidance has actually been quietly depending on his relentless positivity to keep her own inherited harshness in check, a balance neither of them ever fully names, but one that keeps their family working precisely because neither extreme runs the household alone. What Phil deserved, growing up with a father whose only real language was enthusiasm, was proof that disagreement, honestly handled, doesn't have to cost you the people you love. Not a party thrown behind a punishment he never fully committed to enforcing. Not a lifetime spent auditioning for a father-in-law's approval that rarely arrived in full. What he actually received was a model of fatherhood built entirely around avoiding friction. So he built his own adulthood around the same avoidance, certain that keeping everyone happy was the only safety he could actually control. He built an entire personality out of never being the one who disappoints anyone, so rejection could never quite reach him unprepared. He built it so well, he nearly missed how much it was costing the people who actually needed him to hold a boundary once in a while. And in Claire's blunt honesty met without flinching, in Gloria's uncomplicated affection, in the rare moment he finally said no and the house didn't fall apart, that was the boy still auditioning for love, finally quietly discovering he never had to. The enthusiasm was never about the enthusiasm. It never was. So was Phil Dunphy simply a goofy, easygoing dad, or a man terrified of disappointing anyone? Neither, honestly. Phil wasn't a naturally carefree man who happened to avoid conflict occasionally, and he wasn't a deeply anxious man merely performing cheerfulness for effect. He was someone who turned his father's relentless positivity into an entire survival strategy, because keeping everyone happy always felt safer than finding out what happens the moment someone isn't. Maybe that's truer of more parents, more people we know, than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person trying hardest to keep everyone smiling isn't avoiding conflict because it doesn't matter to him. He's avoiding it because somewhere along the way, he learned that disappointing someone might cost him more than he could bear to risk. So here's what I want to know. If Phil had grown up watching his father handle disagreement honestly instead of avoiding it entirely, do you think he still becomes a man who needs everyone to like him? Or was that need always going to find him somewhere, given the household that raised him? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.